In January 1943, a German officer handed a pilot a small parcel on the last plane out of Stalingrad. Inside was a wedding ring, sent home to a wife that he would never see again. Friedrich Paulus had surrendered the Sixth Army. The blow that fell on his family did not come from the enemy, it came from Berlin. The parcel reached Baden-Baden, a spa town in southwest Germany where Elena Paulus was waiting for a message from her husband. Everyone called her Coca. She had been born into the Rossetti family, one of the oldest aristocratic houses in Romania, and she married Friedrich Paulus on the 4th of July, 1912. They had met through her two brothers, who served as officers in his regiment. He was the son of a bookkeeper with no title of his own. She brought the aristocracy to the marriage, he brought the ambition. For 3 decades, their lives tracked his career through the German army, from staff postings to the high command that helped plan the invasion of the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1942, he commanded the Sixth Army, the largest German formation on the Eastern Front, and he led it into the city on the Volga that would consume it. The 3 children had grown up inside that military world. Olga, born in 1914, had married Achim von Kutzenbach, a baron who served as one of her father's own staff officers. The twin sons, Friedrich and Ernst Alexander, born in April 1918, both became career officers, following their father, whose name the elder twin shared. Then came the encirclement. In November 1942, a Soviet offensive trapped the Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. Hitler forbade any breakout, and through the winter, the army was worn down by cold, hunger, and constant fighting. On the 30th of January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, noting that no German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was unmistakable. He was expected to take his own life. Paulus, a devout Catholic, refused. The next morning, he surrendered. Of the more than 90,000 men who went into captivity with him, only a few thousand would ever return to Germany. The Sixth Army that had marched to the Volga had ceased to exist. Paulus himself disappeared into the Soviet prison system, and for his family in Baden-Baden, the news from the East simply stopped. They did not know whether he was alive, and for a long time, no one could tell them. Before the end, he had sent his wedding ring on that final flight. Coca kept it. She had no way of knowing she would never see her husband again, nor that the worst danger to her family was still ahead. For more than a year, Friedrich Paulus stayed silent in Soviet captivity. He refused his captors' appeals to speak out against Hitler, and he held to the soldiers' code that had governed his whole life. Then, on the 20th of July 1944, a group of German officers tried to kill Hitler with a bomb at his headquarters. The attempt failed, and the reprisals that followed convinced Paulus that the regime was beyond saving. On the 8th of August 1944, his voice came over Radio Moscow. He had joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a body of captured German officers sponsored by the Soviets, and he called on his countrymen to abandon Hitler and end the war. For a field marshal to broadcast such an appeal from enemy soil was, in Berlin's eyes, treason of the highest order. He was not alone in the decision. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, one of his own corps commanders at Stalingrad, had helped lead the movement, and other captured officers lent it their names. They saw it as a way to shorten a war they were certain was already lost. Berlin saw a betrayal by men it could no longer punish. The regime could not reach Paulus, it could reach his family. The Nazi state revived an old practice it called Sippenhaft, or kin liability, holding relatives answerable for the actions of one man. Across Germany that summer, the Gestapo had already taken more than 100 people from the families of the July plotters. Now it turned to the families of the officers who had joined the committee in Moscow. They came for Coca. By later accounts, the Gestapo offered her a way out, renounce her husband, give up the name Paulus, and she could go free. Whether or not the offer was made as the story has it, the outcome is not in doubt. In November 1944, she was taken into custody. Relatives connected to the Moscow Committee were often treated with particular severity. Where some families of the July conspirators were released after a few months, the wife of Friedrich Paulus would be held until the war's final days, and she was not taken alone. Her daughter and her young grandson were arrested with her. Olga von Kutzenbach had already lost more than most. In July 1944, her 2-year-old daughter, born with a disability, died in Baden-Baden. That September, her husband, Achim, an officer who had served on her father's staff, was killed on the Eastern Front. Then on the 3rd of November 1944, the Gestapo came for Olga, her young son, and her mother. She was a widow with a small child when they took her. The three of them, the grandmother, mother, and boy of 2, were held in camps near Berlin and in Silesia, and finally at Dachau, north of Munich. They were Sippenhaft prisoners, hostages against a man the regime could no longer reach. Himmler had defended the practice openly that summer, telling party officials that an officer's treason ran in the blood of his whole family. Among those held under it were members of the Stauffenberg family, arrested after the July plot. As the front collapsed, they were shunted west toward Bavaria, ahead of the advancing Allies. Each transfer another blind journey across a ruined country, under guard with no word of where they were going. For Olga, it was loss upon loss. Her father was in Moscow, broadcasting for the enemy. Her husband was dead. Her small daughter buried at home. What was left of her family rode beside her, her mother and her little boy. Whether her father even knew they had been taken, she had no way of telling. Liberation came on the 30th of April 1945, when American forces reached Dachau. Olga, her mother, and her son were free, but Olga was in no state to travel far. She spent the next 4 months recovering in Reuter in the Tyrol before she was strong enough to make the journey home. At the end of August 1945, she returned to Baden-Baden. She had survived. She came home a widow, her health worn down by the months in the camps, to a country in ruins and a family scattered across 2 occupation zones and a Soviet prison. She would live another 58 years, long enough to see her father again and to outlast almost everyone touched by the Stalingrad story, dying in 2003. But the family she returned to in 1945 was already broken in ways that would never fully mend. The twin sons had gone to war as officers, like their father. Only one of them came home. Friedrich, the elder twin, served as a captain in Italy. On the 29th of February 1944, while his father sat in Soviet captivity, he was killed in action on the Anzio beachhead south of Rome. He was 25. He was later laid to rest in the family grave in Baden-Baden, the first of the Pauluses to be buried there. His twin, Ernst Alexander, also a captain, had fought at Stalingrad. He was wounded in the fighting and flown out of the encirclement before it closed, which spared him his father's fate in the Soviet camps. It did not spare him the Gestapo. When his father joined the committee in Moscow, Ernst Alexander was arrested under the same kin liability that had taken his mother and his sister. He survived the war. When the fighting ended, the survivors gathered what was left. By later accounts, Ernst Alexander and his mother settled in West Germany, where he cared for her through the years that followed. The Romanian aristocrat who had once moved easily through army society now lived quietly and out of sight, under a name that had become a burden in both halves of defeated Germany. She never recovered from the separation nor from the years of fear inflicted on her family in that name. Coca Paulus died in 1949 in Baden-Baden, 4 years before her husband was freed. She had not seen him since 1942. By then, the world had heard from Paulus again. In early 1946, the Soviets brought him to Nuremberg as a witness for the prosecution, a German field marshal testifying against the leaders of the regime he had once served. The appearance stunned a German public that had assumed him dead. For his wife and children, it set them further apart from their countrymen than ever. Friedrich Paulus was released from Soviet captivity in 1953, a full decade after Stalingrad. He chose to live in Dresden, in communist East Germany, where he worked in military history research. He was reunited with his daughter Olga, the one member of his immediate family who could still cross to see him, and she visited him in Dresden. But the wife he had married in 1912 was already 4 years dead. While he lived, he never stood beside her grave. Paulus died in Dresden on the 1st of February 1957 of a nerve disease, 14 years after the surrender at Stalingrad. In his will, he asked to be buried beside Coca. He was carried west to Baden-Baden and laid in the family grave, next to the wife he had not seen in the last 15 years of his life. One wound stayed open. Ernst Alexander, the surviving twin, carried the weight of Stalingrad for the rest of his life. On the 19th of June 1970, he took his own life. He was 52 years old, the same age his father had been when he surrendered the 6th Army at Stalingrad and set in motion everything that followed for the family that shared his name. In the end, the Paulus family paid for Stalingrad long after the battle was over, not only in captivity and death, but in the years of silence that followed. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, watch our other World War II videos next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside, and we'll see you in the next one.